Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for a webinar. We'll kick off in a few seconds, but I'd like to just a couple quick housekeeping issues. Please feel free to enter your questions into the question box, and we will get to the questions towards the end of the webinar. We'll leave plenty of time to do that. We always think that the ability to ask questions is really important, so we'll definitely take your questions and encourage you to ask your questions as you have them. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us for our webinar today. I'm your host, Carrie Dowd, Vice President of Marketing and Customer Experience at Insite Software. Whether you are selling directly to a consumer or to another company, one thing is certain: everyone wants and expects intuitive, easy-to-navigate experiences. Customers have come to expect these seamless user experiences largely due to their experiences in B2C, but that doesn't mean it's impossible to achieve in B2B. The truth is, the technology market to support the complex needs of online B2B selling was not always as mature as that of B2C. It's now fair to say that those tides have shifted as B2B commerce have officially come of age. Today you will learn about the key findings from the Forrester Wave B2B Commerce Suites Q3 2018, what makes a B2B Commerce Suite different than a B2C Commerce Suite, and how businesses like yours can leverage new capabilities to springboard their digital practices. I'm excited to welcome our guest speaker, John Bruno. John Bruno is a senior analyst at Forrester, helping e-commerce and channel strategy professionals assess, improve, and optimize B2B and B2B2C e-commerce and configure price quote CPQ technologies and strategies. Bruno was the lead author of the Forrester Wave B2B E-Commerce Suites Q3 2018 and Forrester's 2018 B2B E-Commerce Playbook. He is an advisor to many Fortune 1000 companies, is widely quoted in a major industry publications, and frequently speaks at conferences on customer engagement strategies, channel partner enablement, and digital transformation. John earned his BA from Boston College, where he double majored in economics and philosophy. Welcome, John.
Hi, Carrie, and thanks so much for having me. It's a really exciting topic to talk about, not just because of what's happening in the market, but also because over the past, 7 or so months, I've poured pretty much every ounce and every waking moment into this piece of research. So I almost feel like a proud parent now that it's out, available, and into the public, and there's just so much to share from what went into it. But like you had mentioned, we did delineate between B2B e-commerce suites and platforms, B2B between B2C. And so it begs the question, with many of the same experiences looking to be delivered, much of the same underlying technology empowering the overall commerce and digital buying experience, it begs the question: why Forrester and why, John, did you choose to evaluate B2B commerce suites separately from B2C? And so when we look at that, we have over the years taken a very close look at both consumer and business markets. And what we have here on this slide is Forrester's forecast for B2B e-commerce sales in the U.S. And what we find is that by 2020, we're projecting north of $1.2 trillion in revenue being sold online. And what's important in that $1.2 trillion number is the fact that these transactions, these purchases, don't include purchases going through EDI. What's also interesting in here is if we go a cut deeper, there's some interesting data underpinning all of these. Now, in B2B, you can be in any vertical imaginable, but most of the companies that we work with are either in some form of manufacturing space or distribution space. And so I think about the folks that I tend to work with closely, and you have a lot of distributors in plumbing and HVAC and electrical. And just one quick data point underpinning this is that electrical and electronic goods in particular, by that same 2020 timeframe, are going to see more than 20% of their overall sales coming through their e-commerce channel. And then when we look most closely at the verticals or sub-verticals that are going to be driving the fastest growth over the next couple of years, it's going to be areas like vehicle parts, machinery, equipment and supplies. So really, this uptick that we're seeing in B2B commerce in the next couple of years is being driven in all areas and all industries. And so pushing forward, we're seeing obviously this appetite for self-service. We're seeing this appetite for digital engagements grow. But what we're seeing when we look a little bit more closely at buyer preferences, we see a number of things pop out. And just to kind of preface this data a little bit, this is a 2018 survey that we here at Forrester did with our friends at B2B EC News. And what we looked at two separate groups. We looked at organizations selling online, but here in this particular graph, we look at individuals or buying organizations and their purchasing and buying patterns online. And so if we look at the top here, we start looking at the preference around how you choose to interact with manufacturers or distributors, around gathering information, around conducting research. And we're seeing that roughly 2/3 of buyers say that they have a preference to not interact with a person, not interact with a sales rep, but instead do that research on their own. And part of the reason why they want to do that research on their own is a very similar percentage say that they find that experience of gathering information online superior to working with the person. That means that I can do things at my convenience. It's a low pressure environment. The amount of information that's readily available to me now is greater than it's ever been. And so when you look at the research part of the buying process and then compare that to the buying part of the process, it's eerily similar. At the same time, those same buyers say that buying from a website is much more convenient than buying from a salesperson. And when someone has made up their mind, when they've identified a product or service and feel confident in the product or service that they're buying, they prefer to place that transaction online rather than working with a salesperson. Now, across the board from research to purchase, we're seeing roughly a 2-to-1 ratio with regards to preference for self-service over assisted interactions. Now, what does that mean for the technology market powering these experiences? Well, it means that B2B businesses who are chasing after those customer preferences, who are chasing after digitally savvy and digitally native buyers, well, they need to empower those experiences. And compared to what was done decades ago, or even as recently as the past 5 years, where many folks had custom-built bespoke applications, oftentimes on top of their ERP, but with a web front end, what's now happening is businesses are embracing packaged software. Not just packaged software, there's an uptick in cloud packaged software. And so what that means is the market of software vendors enabling, empowering, and delivering these experiences has been growing quite significantly over the past 10 years. And so that's a little bit of background as to how and why we got to where we are. But what I want to make sure we do before moving forward is provide an overview of what exactly the Forrester Wave is, what is included, and how the Forrester Wave breaks down its evaluation. But not only that, how you, as an individual, can take the research findings and really use them and tailor the outcomes for your own business. So for the Wave, which is our evaluative piece of research that looks at either technology vendors or service providers. In this case, we looked at the most prominent technology providers in the e-commerce space with a focus on B2B. So what that means is that each of the included vendors in this evaluation had to have the critical components of a commerce suite. And so when we say commerce suite, what we're talking about is the features and functionality that allow businesses to create a compelling digital experience. And so some of the components we see around there, obviously there's core commerce capability, like being able to manage product catalogs, pricing, the shopping cart and checkout experiences. But we're also talking about the features and functionality to deliver a rich front-end experience through web content management, to deliver detailed quality product information through product information management, the management of digital assets, handling order management and fulfillment activities, as well as so much more. So first, the vendors included in this evaluation have to have all of the key pieces in delivering that overall experience. But secondly, and critically, the vendors included in this evaluation need to show a strong affinity and deliver strong functionality that are geared specifically towards the needs of a B2B business. And so we'll talk a little bit later on as to what that looks like, but it's about taking the complexities that exist offline in B2B and being able to manifest that functionality, those relationships in a digital footprint that's easy and intuitive to use. And that, lastly, we always want to make sure that when we're doing an evaluation, we are evaluating the vendors that Forrester clients care most about. And so each of the vendors included in this evaluation has attained considerable mind share from our customer base. So in addition to writing research and authoring evaluative research, one of the things that I do quite frequently here at Forrester is field incoming inquiry calls on specific topics. One of the most popular is vendor selection for B2B Commerce Suites. And as part of the inclusion criteria, I wanted to make sure that I focused on the most popular or the most frequently mentioned vendors in this evaluation. And so next, let's actually take a look at what the evaluation looks like. So you can see here the iconic wave graphic on the right, where we break down vendors across a couple of categories: leaders, strong performers, contenders, and challengers. But what's important is understanding what makes up those rankings. And so if we look at our vertical axis, we're looking at the current offering. And here at Forrester, the current offering is designed to show the relative strength of the currently available version of the product being evaluated in this evaluation. So if you were to buy a product from any of these vendors, we are evaluating the most recent version of that product. Secondly, if we look at the horizontal axis, we're talking about strategy. And the strategy axis is designed to show how relatively well we think the vendor will fare in the future, how well aligned they are to the market that they serve. And lastly, if you look at the size of the dot or bubble on the graphic on the right, that's an indication of market presence. And market presence is designed to show how large, impactful, meaningful, or important each vendor is in the market in which they play. So at this point in time, you might be thinking, okay, well, there's two axes. It's pretty easy to place a dot there. But there's actually a lot more that goes on under the covers. And so across each of those three measurable components, there's a litany of criteria that we evaluate each of the vendors on. So what we're showing right now are the top level criteria underneath each of those. And underneath these top level criteria, there are often sub criteria. So for instance, if we look at a category under current offering like personalization, personalization is made up under content and offer personalization, A/B testing, and product, service, or bundle configuration. So across this evaluation, we looked at north of 30 discrete criteria and ranked each and every vendor across those criteria. You'll also notice on the right-hand side of each of the criteria is Forrester's weighting. So we weight the current offering and strategy equally at 50%, but underneath each of those, based on the kinds of questions that we get, based on the functionality that's required to deliver the most appropriate experiences in B2B, we have weighted each of the sub-criteria accordingly. For those of you who will be reading the report later on or downloading the assets associated with that, you actually have the ability to reweight the criteria as you see fit and have the order, rankings, and placements shake out to your needs. So now that we've gone through what the wave looks like and how we put it together, what I want to do is I want to focus on the scope of the evaluation. And so we take the wave process here at Forrester quite seriously. In fact, I had mentioned earlier that this has been a labor of love of sorts. And the process for this evaluation really started in January and into February, with the final result being published in the September timeframe. And so that includes all of the criteria formulation. That includes, going through and vetting that information, making sure that it was accurate. That includes inviting each of the included vendors to complete a detailed questionnaire. It also includes bringing each of the vendors in for a lab day where they demonstrate the capabilities of their product based on demo scenarios that we've outlined. And it also includes speaking to a number of customers actively using those technology platforms to power their business. So all in all, we're talking about hundreds of hours of research going into this one document. And so when we look at what we decided to include in the evaluation, we wanted to make sure that we really understood and captured the nuance of B2B. And so one of the most important things to understand in managing a digital commerce environment focused on the needs of B2B businesses is that it's important to understand the complexity of relationships. And so the hierarchy of relationships and accounts and users within those accounts is paramount. So here you have yourself, your business, and on one hand, you need to know the relationships you have with the accounts that you do business with. So that means being able to understand the accounts with regards to, say, the industry that they work in, the location of which their business resides in, things of that nature. But you also need to understand, both in relation to your business, but also in relationship to those accounts, those B2B buyers. And those B2B buyers come with their own complexity of information and data about who they are, what they have access to, and what privileges they have. But for most organizations, that B2B buyer doesn't act alone. That B2B buyer might, in fact, be a member of a larger buying team. And within that buying team, they might have access to certain permissions. They might be an administrator or someone in procurement who has universal access, but they might be an individual who only has access to certain parts of the product catalog, or they might be prescribed a certain budget of which they're able to spend on certain items in a particular point in time. In order to deliver a compelling B2B experience through these digital channels, you have to make sure that you account for and manage around those relationships, those restrictions, and those behaviors. And in the most complex of scenarios, that individual might have a relationship with the key account, but part of that organization might be a subsidiary or a child account. And they might have different relationships between the parent account and the child account. So the number of areas that make B2B complex is growing by the day. One other area that's important to look at when evaluating a B2B commerce platform is the need to support complex channel strategies. And if you're like me, you've probably heard the term omnichannel used quite a bit. And oftentimes the term omnichannel has been relegated to folks in the B2C world, whether it is purchasing something online, picking up in store, whether it is purchasing in store and having that fulfilled directly to your house. It's blending the offline and online worlds. But I'm actually in the camp where I believe that executing against an omni-channel strategy is actually considerably more difficult in a B2B environment. Because yes, you have your online channel, but you also have a whole myriad of what has been traditionally offline channels that now need to be digitally enabled. And so when I say offline channels, I'm talking about things like how you're powering the experiences for your salespeople, how you're powering the experiences for your customer service reps, or how you're powering experiences that might take place in a physical location like a branch. Now, because of the complex relationships of B2B and the expectations at play, such as I've already negotiated pricing with you, that puts an onus on the selling business to make sure that experience is consistent across all of these channels. If I walk into a branch, talk to a salesperson, talk to a customer service agent, or go online on my own, I should expect to see the appropriate products. I should expect to see the pricing that is relevant and applicable to me across every single one of those in a consistent fashion. The next area of complexity is what that process looks like. Now, we've already talked about the complex environment in which a B2B buyer might operate in and their role potentially being part of a team. But you have to ask yourself the questions, are you showcasing and selling only the products that you're allowed to sell to a particular buyer? So an example of this is I was working with an electrical distributor in the Mid-Atlantic, and they were only allowed to sell certain products to customers in North Carolina, but customers in South Carolina and Georgia were able to buy from a different part of the product catalog. And so one is, are you selling the appropriate products? And then two here, another facet down is that individual being shown the products that their buying organization wants to show to them? Secondly, we talked about budget. Do you have the sufficient funds to purchase the products necessary? But beyond that, when you start getting into the one-off processes of things like maybe I've gone over my budget, or I'm selecting a product that I might not have the rights to purchase, what kinds of approvals need to happen both internally and externally? So if I'm over my spend budget, I don't want to immediately be shut down. I might want to make a request for that purchase that then needs to get routed to someone on my buying team. Are they able to handle that request and fulfill the process through this digital medium, or does this process need to go offline and become disjointed? Secondly, the complexity in buying process isn't just left to the buy side of the equation, it's also on the sell side. So if I'm a customer, a loyal customer that's purchased a lot of product and spent a lot of money with a business over the years, and now I'm making a large purchase or something that is different, a different set of products that I'm normally purchasing, I might want to negotiate a better price or a discount. And in many situations in the past, that purchase would have to go from an online channel to an offline channel, and then a customer doesn't know where they should operate from in the future. So it's important for B2B commerce platforms now to be able to be that negotiating table in a digital medium. So when I say I'm looking for a discount on this order, that the salesperson that I'm working with gets notified of that they have authority and control and privileges necessary to offer me the appropriate offer and pricing and products that are still within the guidelines of their business. So it becomes so much more than a website. It becomes more like an application that powers not only the buy side of the equation, but also the sell side. Next, B2B platforms sell inherently different products than B2C platforms. And so it's not uncommon, specifically with manufacturers, to sell complex products, but it's also not uncommon to see things like kits or bundles. So if there are a series of products that are often sold together, say for the purpose of installing a piece of machinery, you might want to offer those up as a single unit. Someone could navigate to that kit or bundle from your cart, from your catalog, add that to a cart, and now they're purchasing the appropriate quantities of the appropriate products to complete a job at hand. I always say to folks that one of the major differences between buyer preferences on B2B and B2C is that B2B buyers don't shop because the experience is emotionally appealing or enjoyable. They're purchasing because they have a job to do. And the ability to create kits and bundles like this makes it so that the buying process is easier, it's more effective, and it's streamlined. And what that does for the buyer is it allows them to focus on the other key critical components of doing their job. And so what I want to focus on next are what exactly are the key research findings that came out of the evaluation? Well, one is, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, is that the market for B2B commerce platforms is growing. And as a result of that, there's a market opportunity for traditional commerce technology vendors. Some of them have gracefully moved into the B2B market by building out new capabilities and functionality. But on average and on aggregate, many B2C vendors have awkwardly positioned themselves to play in the B2C market. So when we think about the complexity that we just walked through for the past couple minutes, it's important that unless you have referrals or other proof points and evidence that the vendor that you're engaging with is operating in a B2B capacity effectively, you might want to do more due diligence to make sure that it's not more messaging and marketing than it is product. Because falling short or failing on delivering the promises that a B2B buyer is looking for could bring you back to the drawing board and force you to have to do it all over again. Secondly, is this notion of suites. As Carrie had mentioned at the top of the call, this is the Forrester Wave for B2B Commerce Suites. Came out in Q3 2018. And so one of the top questions that pops up is to suite or not to suite. And what that means is increasingly we're seeing vendors offer a wide array of functionality, a broad platform, everything from managing core commerce functionality to things like the front end experience to how you manage, understand, and capture complex product information. Now, in each of those areas, there are technologies to handle those discrete functions. But the question here is, to what degree do you need to buy a best-in-class solution versus using what comes with your commerce platform? And increasingly what we've seen is that, again, comparing B2B to B2C, is that many B2B organizations have kind of arrived at the party, I'll say, fashionably late. Meaning they don't have the years or even decades of experiences that their B2C counterparts have. And so priority number one is delivering a quality experience as quickly as possible. And you might not have the team or resources necessary at hand to support a best-in-breed approach. So if you're a smaller organization, if you are an organization that is embracing digital for the first time, if you have fewer staff or you want to manage the commerce experience more internally than through a systems integrator, you might want to look at platforms that have well-integrated components already within them. And the reason being is business users are able to leverage the same toolkit, the same set of administrative functionality and experiences to architect the end experience that your buyer gets. As you mature, that strategy might change. As you mature, you might want to swap out a content management system for a best-in-class content management system. So it's about looking at vendors that have that suite functionality, but also down the road, if you feel like you want to grow or grow out of what that vendor might offer, that the product is architected in a way that you could swap out a piece of functionality here or there. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. So here is a more detailed breakdown of what those different components look like. But increasingly, as more businesses are embracing digital, they're looking to deliver at least good enough in each of these areas. So when we look at areas in the Wave itself, you saw a criteria for commerce management in the Commerce Suite itself. And in those are where you'll see things like order management, product information management, web content management, or digital asset management. And so when you look at the evaluation, make sure to weight each of these criteria appropriately based on the needs of your business, or if you have any of these technologies already in place. The other piece that was really interesting coming out of this research is that increasingly it's becoming about the experience. Now, the operations and execution of completing a purchase are one thing, but increasingly B2B buyers expect rich contextual experiences. And through that same survey I had referred to earlier, what we found is that 98% of B2B buyers are starting their buying process, largely from the research perspective, through a digital medium, through a digital touch point, be it through their laptop or desktop or on a mobile device like a tablet and a smartphone. And so what does that mean when we're talking about delivering richer experiences? Well, the good news here is that B2B platforms have started to mature, not just on the complexities of access and permissions or workflows or quick ordering tools, but they've also started to pay homage to marketers and merchandisers and the jobs that they need to complete day in, day out. So now in 2018, marketers are finally getting the love that they deserve from B2B commerce platforms. And so when you think about building front-end experiences, it's about building experiences that are going to work across device, be it a laptop, desktop, mobile device, or even to the point where you're building actual native applications across iOS and Android devices. And these folks shouldn't be responsible for coding their own HTML or CSS or JavaScript. These commerce platforms are providing content management tools that allow users to drag and drop information and content blocks and components so that they're building from a tool set and the Lego pieces, if you will, of a digital experience as opposed to custom defining everything. Secondly, increasingly, we're looking to get to a point where we are moving from generalized experiences to hyper-personalized experiences. And in that, segments matter. And this is something that B2B commerce platforms have borrowed from B2C. And so in order to deliver those personalized experiences, you have to know exactly who your customers are, fit them into segments so that you can better market and sell to them. And so what that means is looking at that customer data we talked about earlier, knowing where they are, knowing what browsing patterns they've gone through, knowing what purchasing patterns they've gone through. Looking at things like transactional trends, you might be able to identify something like your most loyal or highest value customers. And you might want to offer them something different than what your average customer gets. So, for instance, if you have a buyer who's spending X amount over the past 90 days, in anything above that threshold, you want to honor and offer them something special, you might want to do things like offer them free shipping. Now, the only way to do stuff like this is to personalize at scale by using customer segmentation and personalization capabilities. But how do you know if that's working? So the last piece here that's starting to come more into the fray is how you're executing on your digital strategies to make them smarter. So things like A/B testing and multivariate testing tools allow you to do just that. You can use segments, you can use customer profiles and start showing them options. And based on the options that are yielding the appropriate business benefit, whether it's increasing your average order value, whether it is increasing your conversion rate or click-through rate, these are all things that you can test. And once a test is completed, you can enact those changes at scale. So it's about building richer experiences that are more personalized, that you can measure and iterate based off of. And so the next piece that's really important here is that B2B Commerce Suites have opened up what I refer to as the customer aperture. Who is the customer of the technology you're providing? And increasingly, the definition of customer has evolved. And for B2B, it's important to look at it really from two angles. There's the internal angle and the external angle. I think we all know the external angle in that you have a buyer visiting a site who's looking to make a purchase. But as I had mentioned earlier, the role that that buyer plays or that user plays can vary quite significantly. They can be the actual buyer who's going to be using the product. They can be someone who is somewhere in that approval chain if approval is required. They could be someone in procurement who is setting limits on what can be seen and what can be purchased. But you have that myriad of folks on the buy side of the equation. But if you look across the table, or in this case, look across the B2B commerce platform, there are also customers or users on the sell side. So when you think about that, you want to keep in mind the functionality that's being provided by the B2B commerce platform to enable your sales reps to do things like build carts or quotes on behalf of your buyer. For a CSR to make sure that they're able to address the needs of a buyer in the moment. So if someone calls in and has a need that can be addressed there, rather than routing them over to someone else, that it can be handled through that touch point. Or potentially sales managers who are looking at analytics and what trends are occurring in their region so they can provide better coaching and guidance to their reps. Or in other cases, when you've got a complex channel strategy at play, the role that the commerce platform provides for that channel to either sell or for a business like a manufacturer to start pushing quality leads to your channel partners. So it's important to think about customers as anyone who is getting value out of the commerce platform. And the greater you can open up that aperture to not only include folks on the buy side, but also individuals on the sell side will dictate your growth and success in the future. The other interesting piece is that we've seen a heightened focus on analytics. And not just analytics from the testing perspective, but analytics with regards to how you optimize the digital experience. Doing things like understanding how well your search functions are performing, understanding how well your cross-sell or upsell recommendations are performing. Really, for B2B organizations, it's time for them to become kind of data nerds, to become obsessed with data and analytics so that they can fine-tune and optimize the digital experiences, the offers and promotions, all with the customer in mind. And so what this all boils down to is the fact that B2B Commerce Suites have actually reached their maturity. What I mean when I say that is we've moved from an age in which the business was run by the back office. The business was run by the ERP, and you've bolted on a front end as simply an ordering portal. What we're now talking about here is a time where we've come of age where we're able to now support all of the complexities with B2B on one hand and marry it with the rich digital experience capabilities that have been traditionally only been found in B2C platforms. And so just like a fine wine, things only get better with age, and we're at the point right now where it's okay to drink from that B2B Commerce Suite. It's okay to power the experiences that are going to differentiate you from your competitors by looking at the features and functionality that I've walked through today and the features and functionality that have been included in our Forrester Wave on B2B Commerce Suites from Q3 2018. So with that, I thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Carrie.
Thanks, John. Couple questions here. Feel free to keep putting your questions in. We'd love to answer as many questions as possible. So here's a good question, John. We often talk about B2B and B2C, and this question is around, is there really a big difference between B2B and B2C e-commerce?
There really is. I had mentioned earlier that there's a number of B2C commerce vendors who are awkwardly trying to get into the B2B space. And where you see them traditionally fall short are not in the areas where you can go online, add something to a cart and purchase it, which is kind of the long tail of B2B, the very simple orders. But in B2B, what I often find is that the exception to the rule is actually a lot more common than the rule itself. So what that means is those one-off situations where there is an approval or those one-off situations where there is negotiation at play, that kind of workflow and understanding not just the relationships amongst the buyer organization, but the relationships to the selling organization and the individuals at the selling organization, that kind of data model really isn't in place in a lot of these B2C commerce platforms. So that's one. And then two is largely on the product side. It's pretty straightforward in many B2C environments. The ability to kind of understand a product catalog, but in B2B, we're largely talking about vast catalogs. Where 10,000 or more items is really nothing to bat an eye at. In fact, many businesses have hundreds of thousands of items or potentially even millions of items. So being able to understand those items, all the product information around those items, and then have all the administrative tools at your disposal so that from a business, you can start to whittle that down to the meaningful things for your customers, and so that your customers can further whittle that down for the meaningful things for their individual users. Really what B2B buying is about completing a process in a quick, easy, and effective manner. And without those tools, I can tell you right now that the process of making a transaction without them won't be quick, won't be easy, and it certainly won't be effective.
Perfect. Here's another question. They're starting to come in droves here. How many vendors were evaluated total, not just the ones that made the wave, but the total number that you evaluated?
Great question. So I'll start with what's in the wave. So we looked, like I mentioned earlier, we wanted to make sure we focused the evaluation on vendors that offered complete functionality, vendors that were geared towards B2B, and vendors that frequently popped up in Forrester customer inquiries. So the wave itself, where you saw the graphic earlier, there were 12 vendors. But in our stream of research in which we looked at folks that were more broadly applicable in a B2B environment, we were talking about several dozen. We wrote another kind of companion report that came out before this wave that had roughly 24 vendors, and even beyond that, tracking probably another dozen or more. So really what you're seeing in the evaluation are the top most meaningful 12 out of a good 35, 40 vendors that were actively tracking day in, day out.
Great, thank you. Okay, this is a long one. Hold on. I got to find it. They keep coming in. Are there any specific technologies out there that B2B commerce platforms need to add either through development or M&A to facilitate future development of this optimal user customer experience?
Yeah, so it's interesting, and this is where I would encourage those of you on the line to actually look at the evaluation and the criteria that were evaluated. And because every business is a little bit different, you might weight some of these things differently as well. So for some of you, it might mean looking at more advanced personalization capabilities. It might be looking at bespoke search tools so that you're able to build more intelligence into the customer engagement processes. For others, like manufacturers of machinery, it might mean augmenting what you do from a commerce standpoint with, say, a solution to support rules-driven configuration. So if you have gone from selling, say, parts for farm equipment online, and now you want to expand that to sell the actual pieces of machinery themselves that are oftentimes more complex, areas like CPQ might be one where you would extend what happens from a commerce environment. But until those things become more mainstream, I'm not weighting those too heavily in this evaluation for the Commerce Suites, as many of them offer good enough, but not best in breed in those kind of tangential or areas on the periphery.
Yeah, and I think, adding to that, just from our years of experience, is that platforms that really focus on B2B and they're not trying to catch up, coming from the B2C world, trying to catch up per se. You're often seeing functionality get added before a lot of these companies get to that point, because there's other customers asking for that. And then the second thing is that if you're really big in things like using CPQ, as you mentioned, having that infrastructure that allows for extension customization or connecting to external best in breed like a CPQ, those are things that are just really important to consider when you're looking at a platform. It's somebody that's going to take those things into account. Let's see here. In this report, do you get to the detailed level of account management integration and availability of APIs? So do you look at integration, external integration?
We do. So in this report, so I guess to abstract one level up from integration, what we look at probably most closely is platform architecture. And in platform architecture, we'll look at things like APIs, not only availability, but we also look at things like available documentation of those APIs so that developers can understand how to use them most effectively. But we're also looking at things like, where you might find customer account or product data outside of the commerce platform. So we look at things like integrations to CRM platforms. We'll look at, to a certain extent, integrations into ERP systems. I will throw the caveat out there on the latter of the two, is that with so much work having been done in ERP systems in particular, the systems that run most businesses, they tend to be customized to the point where it isn't just a straightforward productized integration. There's a little bit more work that needs to be done. So we do look at that there, but I would encourage you to do a more detailed analysis of kind of what you're looking to bring into the commerce environment, and if that requires any additional customization. Really, that tends to be one of the longer elements of an implementation, and where I would strongly recommend, looking at an external service provider to help you do that. But with regards to, do we look at the commerce platform itself's ability to handle customer account information and data, and availability of APIs and extensibility? That's all within the report as well.
Perfect. So this question is around extending technologies, PIM, DAM, any of those types of things. How do you see the Commerce Suites developing where you don't know what to keep in the suite and what to do in external systems? So how do you know? I'm interpreting this as basically, how do you know if there's enough PIM capabilities within the suite, as an example, or when you would want to go to an external PIM? And how are these suites kind of looking at those type of scenarios that you evaluated?
Sure. So I'll actually answer the question backwards. So the way the suites are addressing these scenarios is largely one of a couple of options. One of which is, I'm going to build this functionality. I'm going to build something that will compete with a best-in-class PIM. Another of which is, I am going to acquire this functionality. I might acquire, just like many have done over the years, a smaller vendor who operates in this space so that I can deliver that. And the third is a partnership. There are plenty of best-in-class solutions in each one of these adjacencies, and I might want to formulate a partnership with certain vendors based on their applicability in the markets that I serve. And so really, when it comes time to how you would assess whether or not you need to extend the functionality of your Commerce Suite with one of these adjacencies, is really, what business challenge are you looking to solve, and where are you getting caught up? So, for instance, from a PIM perspective, are you able to manage all of your product information if you operate in, if you sell the same product in different verticals? If you sell the same product in different languages, if you have multiple variations or attributes underneath each of those products, or potentially if you need to syndicate that information elsewhere. Does your suite have the ability to push out that same product content to, say, a marketplace like Amazon, or push out that content so that you can produce a physical product catalog? If you go back to my digital medium slide, 1% of people still actually start their journey with physical product catalogs. That very well might be your industry and your customers. And so if you're running into a situation like that, where your Commerce Suite doesn't allow you to do those things, that's when you'd extend. Or if you're at a level where your digital maturity is so high that you feel you're constantly pushing the envelope of the suite vendor that you're working with, it's then. What I find is that if you're a lower level of maturity, maybe you've been doing commerce for a little bit of time, but with some ERP add-on, and now you're moving to a purpose-built Commerce Suite, I always recommend kicking the tires, starting from a point. And if you're at that point, you probably don't have your own PIM already at this point. So I would start from that point and push it. I found a number of customers who felt the suite functionality was plenty sufficient enough in some of these areas, while others said, I learned how to use what I had, and I learned where there were deficiencies. And because of my knowledge of those deficiencies, I knew exactly what I needed to get in one of those adjacent technologies, and it made the evaluation of those technologies easier. But if you look around, I don't think there's going to be any commerce platform that says they're perfect in each one of those areas. So many of them will have partnerships and pre-built integrations into best-of-breed solutions as well, and work with your commerce vendor, work with your systems integrator to help identify when and where those additional adjacencies are needed.
Great. So here's, I think this will be the last question, unless something else pops in here. How about AI and shopping assistant chatbots? How do you see those that functionality playing a role in B2B e-commerce?
Oh, I'm so glad this one came in. I'm really glad this one came in because even in my line of work, we're always looking for the next great thing. We're looking to predict the future. But that being said, it's important to understand when certain things are hype, when certain things are reality. And I will say to a certain extent, AI is playing a role in commerce, but probably not to the extent that you've heard it. It seems to be everywhere these days that there's some machine learning algorithm, some chatbot, or other AI system powering the experiences you have. And the fact of the matter is, for me, when we start talking about personalized experiences and how you execute on those, there's really three ways of doing it. And two of the three don't require any AI whatsoever. So there are things like static rules, and I mentioned this earlier with regards to understanding what products you can sell to a customer based on their physical location. That's not going to change. Or things like dynamic rules, and I mentioned this earlier too with regards to that kind of loyalty offer. Someone spending a lot of money over a short period of time, you might want to make them a special offer. That is doing things like constantly looking at the amount of sales being made to a particular account over a period of time and constantly evaluating and measuring that. Now, the third piece of the equation is AI. It's actually looking at patterns, removing unconscious bias, and things like that to make recommendations. And what I often find is most businesses really don't do a great job at the first two. And so what I say is, look in the mirror, do a self-assessment. If you feel like you are really maxing out the potential of both static and dynamic rules to the point where you would say, yeah, I'd give myself an A- in this area. At that point is when you can start looking at more AI functionality. But the fact of the matter is, few organizations, aside from the very large, very digitally mature ones, are leveraging AI in a meaningful way. And that includes things like chatbots. But if you're able to do things like leverage static and dynamic rules appropriately, if you become obsessed with data like I had mentioned earlier, it becomes ingrained in your DNA. And what that allows you to do is that allows you to collect more data. So when these AI and machine learning technologies evolve more and become more commercially viable, you have all of the fuel to power those experiences. So the work today will help you tomorrow, but focus on doing the work today really well.
Great. Well, we really appreciate you taking the time to present with us today, John, and we really appreciate your insights, and thank you so much.
Thank you.